Hello and welcome in, everybody. We will just give everyone a minute or two to get themselves into the lobby here, and then we'll go over some housekeeping and get started very promptly after that. Okay, I see some more people have joined. So I think while maybe a couple more people sneak in, we will just go ahead and quickly go over the housekeeping. So just a couple things here. Google Chrome is our recommended browser for today's webinar. You will have the best streaming experience on that platform if you need to take a quick moment to switch. Number two is that today's slides and recordings will be shared following the live event. That could vary between either a few hours later or tomorrow, but either way, rest assured it will be sent if you miss anything and need to hear it again. And lastly, if you're having any technical difficulties, please let us know using the Q&A section on the screen that should be located in the bottom right-hand corner. And with that, I will pass it off to Tyler.
Thanks, Valerie. Hi, everyone. We're so glad you're here. I'll tell you the pattern we keep running into with Copilot rollouts. It's almost never the AI that makes or breaks your project. It's usually never your licenses either. It's often the content that's underneath it. So that's exactly what we're going to spend time on here today. We're going to show you a three-part framework to get that right. So let's get started with a composite scenario that we've seen after enterprise Copilot rollouts. Let's picture this. We have a sales team. They're preparing for an important client meeting. It's the end of the quarter. We have a tight deadline, and there's real revenue on the line. And just before that meeting, an account lead asks Copilot, hey, can you get me the latest approved Q2 pricing and also get me supporting materials? Copilot, it responds. It gives you back a clean, a credible looking document, but there's a problem. It's not the current pricing document. It's an older version. That version's about 2 years old. It survived a migration, and it was never clearly marked with an effective date, but it was in an accessible shared location. Now, fast forward, the team uses that pricing document. The client, they accept the proposal. The deal closes. Then, weeks later, finance gets involved. They're auditing the deal, and they find a problem. The margin is materially below target. What really initially looked like a productivity win for the sales team, now we have a pricing remediation issue, and we have a trust issue. Well, that's painful. That wasn't a Copilot failure. It was a content readiness failure. Copilot simply exposed what the environment made available. And if any of that felt familiar or similar to you, you're definitely in the right place. So hi, I'm Tyler. I'm a solutions architect with DriveIQ, an unstructured data management platform. I work with large enterprises. They're usually managing terabytes or petabytes of unstructured content, helping them prepare them for tools like Copilot. And I'm excited to be joined here by Drew Madelon. Let you intro yourself, Drew. You're on mute, brother.
Help organization. So my name is Drew Madeline, and I work at Retrieval, and I help organizations deploy M365 Copilot. And I've been doing this for around 15 years in the space. My world comes from a content management history, right? So my world has been how SharePoint works, how 365 works, how Copilot works. I come at this from very IT pro specific world, and I've worked with DriveIQ to do a lot of data migrations, data management work, and worked with some very large organizations in cleaning up Copilot, cleaning up their unstructured data, and this result, this scenario that we're talking about here that Tyler rose, was something that we see every day, if not multiple times, even in my own environment. And we will, it all kind of, I think when I see this, it starts with, how did this begin? How did we get to this point, right, Tyler? I think I look at this, and this scenario has been what led us to this stage. And we want to start out with a scenario here, Tyler. Like, how do we get into this state? How do people end up in that scenario by pulling a 2-year-old document?
Absolutely. So let's start with the poll. The question being, many of us have rolled out Copilot. Did you end up doing a content review or an audit before you enabled Copilot or before you enabled other AI solutions? We'll give you just a minute to vote.
That's nice seeing the results come in.
Yeah.
And when we see this, this has been something that it's been interesting to see with the different organizations that we've worked with, the different size of the organizations, and where kind of the guardrails for a content review and audit start. Tyler, what do you think about what we're seeing here?
Yeah, so far we have some results in here. Looking for more votes. We have 9 here now, and so far many of us are saying no. We're saying that many of us may have rolled out Copilot. We didn't necessarily perform a content review. We didn't necessarily perform an audit. I'm sure we had a reason. There is definitely a business justification, but we're starting to see no. And Drew, what do you think people are looking for in especially a content review?
So when we've done these content reviews, what we've been focused a lot on has been permission management and access to the information. I think that's going to be the first thing we look at has been, are there any glaring areas that or sites or containers or anywhere this content exists that have something that is out of the ordinary? And it's normally what we see is you have a large content corpus, a large amount of information, and there's no way any human and even AI at this point is going to be able to like sift and find anything and everything that is unique or that is important. So we look at this as a content review to say, is there anything glaring? Is there any red flag? Is there any crown jewel that we see that is going to cause a problem or cause a concern that we need to go look at? And on the audit side, what we see is that's a different approach. Right? I think if we see the audit scenario, right, Tyler, when you're looking at this, if I do a content review, Tyler, how do you see an audit happening? How do you say audit differs from a content review?
Yeah, more so if you're looking at a content review, that usually entails you're looking at accuracy. I'm looking to see ownership and is this still being used? I look at it from a quality lens to say, is my data still earning its place? But when we're looking at an audit, that usually is tied or otherwise carries a compliance or a risk connotation. You're generally running an audit to be checking on people. You may not be checking with people, but you're looking to see, is my data sensitive? Are there regulatory conformance we need to consider? Or otherwise, is access appropriate?
And I've seen the trigger mechanism for that be different, right? Like I've been brought into scenarios where an audit did occur and something was found, and then that might initiate a content review. It might be the IT team or the application team that's owning a certain content service needs to decide they want to do a content review because before an audit comes in, right? So you could have chicken before the egg if you needed to. Here's like they both end up with a similar result of we want to figure out what's going on with our content and try to improve that. Because what's happening out there today has been that when we think about the content that exists, especially the content that can power Copilot and other AI, is going to be that our content does exist everywhere. And as you're thinking about your content, the story Tyler talked about was around M365 Copilot. But the world we're living in with AI, and definitely now in more recent year, in the last 12 months, has been how do we bring content together and enrich our AI platforms, enrich M365 Copilot beyond just the boundaries that we have today. And then how does that interact with the same problem statement that we're thinking of, which is making sure we try to enrich, empower our Copilot data with the best data possible. And when we think about this, you want to make sure you think that it goes beyond that wall. So when you start with how Copilot works. And this is an important aspect to understand, to know where your data falls into play. So if you kind of follow these areas, you have a user or a standard Copilot experience. These are prompts for something. There is a orchestrator, a pre-processing rules, and it goes out and grounds on something, right? That grounding process sends that back to the LLM, replies back, brings that back from a purview perspective, and sends that back as a response. To know where your content interacts with it is part of that grounding phase. So I prompt for something. In Tyler's example, I prompt to build that quote. It's going to go look for your content in the graph. It's going to be your emails, your files, your meetings, your chats, your calendar, all of that meeting, your content's in your tenant, and it's going to ground on that. You can also ground on your connectors, your third-party content, and integrate with that content and ground in that and bring that back up into your Copilot response. And we'll send that back to the LLM, reply back. So your content corpus is anything inside of your tenant boundary with M365 that you have access to. That's what it will reply based on who you are. And that in turn can correlate to any connectors, any third-party connectors or Copilot connectors you bring into this. So knowing when that happens helps understand that there is more than just your core content, and that it does happen before it goes back to the LLM. It brings that information together first. Now, when you do this, your content in M365 is primarily the majority of your content you're going to get is built on that M365 information. It's built on your SharePoint files, your OneDrive files. You want to ground that information. It does go beyond that, right? So it actually starts to build out human connectors, or it's our semantic index functionality behind the scenes of who I'm working with. If I'm working on collaborative files with Tyler, collaborative files with anyone else on my team, working with emails and Teams chats with Tyler, it will self-service that in our semantic index. But the core part of that is your file-based data, your unstructured data that's sitting in SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams that it will ground. From a connector standpoint, there are other options that go along with this. So we have, from a Copilot connector perspective, when we think of getting our content clean or getting our content in a state that is good, there are, in a world that has multi-content estates, you also want to make sure that when you do your content inventory or content audit, you're looking at what is the future content that we want to bring into Copilot. What other places do we have unstructured file information, and are we limiting ourselves from a Copilot perspective because we have not integrated that information into it? By integrating those line of business apps, or you can even integrate your on-premises file shares with to migrate that information, and you just build that file share connector, it's going to naturally inherit whatever was set up in that host information. So when you're thinking about your content corpus, and you're thinking about where your data is, we're moving to a state that we really were focused on the SharePoint and OneDrive opportunities, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, where the content lives there in the graph. And we're starting to move into how can we look at cross-functional or cross-application solutions and enhance this data, not just for human interactions for prompt and response, but moving into automated agentic interactions based on these files and decisions that you make. So when you really get it, what I've seen is as we move into more agentic work processes or agentic transformation processes, that has been where we've had to extend Copilot and the connections into other content corpuses to bring in information together to provide a real value from an agent, and in turn, inheriting the permissions and access that's back in those other locations. So Tyler, what happened?
Yeah, so so far you've peeled back the fact that Copilot interactions. So we've seen how Copilot interactions work, and we've also uncovered that organizations have an ecosystem of unstructured data. And when someone interacts with Copilot or they interact with an agent, Copilot does what it's asked to do. But if we look to see why do we have the unintended or the low quality retrieval, it's usually down to 4 different conditions. And these are the kind of ones that affected the pricing example we started with. First, and usually the one that you can control most, that's your duplicate content. So if you look at duplicates, you usually have multiple versions of the same document. When Copilot can access it, it can retrieve the wrong one that we saw earlier, but have full confidence. What I usually see, this is you've got a version 1, you've got a version final, a final, different versions of that same file or different iterations. But teams end up acting on the outdated versions or what would be conflicting source material. The second one is your rot. That's your redundant, your obsolete, your trivial content. And the effect here is when you have outdated files that are still in, I'll say, your active environments, and you don't have lifecycle control, that's going to pollute the retrieval. It's going to reduce the confidence in the outputs. And over time, you might see users prone to falling back to old search habits. The third one that we see is inconsistent metadata. And if the environment doesn't clearly signal what's authoritative, what's current, sensitivity, what's business critical, then Copilot, it's going to have less cues to otherwise work with. And the result there is lower quality ranking. You might have answers that are less grounded in your otherwise enterprise context. And a fourth key area is over permission content, or otherwise content permissions. You might see access drift over time, and sensitive content could be more broadly available platform by platform, and it can be more available than intended. Copilot can then surface information to the wrong audience when that happens. And that, of course, when you think of sensitivity or permissions, that creates risk really fast. And at that point, if trust drops, adoption is usually going to follow. So overall, if you see these four conditions in your environment, Copilot usage tends to stall. You're going to see less trust, and your licenses will not be used in the way that we plan. So really, if I were to take a theme of this slide, it's that AI and messy content, it's not a winning combination. Let's go to the next slide. We did, thank you. Okay, so next, now that the pricing example we started with, I thought it was useful because it makes that issue tangible. But what we see that's especially important is that it's not isolated. Across rollouts, you might just see a pattern. You have different clients. We've seen different industries, Drew, and all different M365 estates, but you generally have similar stories. We have Copilot, it's deployed, but ROI may be under pressure. Now, what I see is most orgs don't necessarily come up front asking for a content governance engagement. By the time they engage DriveIQ, they're out, they've had Copilot out for several months, they've had a rollout, something feels off, adoption isn't necessarily growing, you might have mixed feedback, and a few high visibility incidents start raising questions, especially at SLT level. So things that usually agitate this is you may have a leader that gave an inconsistent answer in a briefing, or you might have had sensitive content that surfaced in a way that made your org uncomfortable. At that point, it's no longer a deployment issue. Again, you have Copilot, it becomes a trust problem. And then of course, I'll tie it back to the ROI problem. But when we look beneath that pattern, these four themes tend to exist. The first one, similar to what we saw on the previous slide, is stale content. What I'll call stale content, or otherwise your rot. Think of it this way. We have many of us carry large volumes of redundant or obsolete content, ranging from duplicate files from migrations. How many migrations or how many platforms have you moved for before you came to M365? Or if you have multiple repositories, how many times have you migrated? Sometimes it's even back and forth. And your migration team might not have time to clean up while you're doing the migration. You just have to be the moving company. You might also have more impactful ones that are nuanced, have pricing sheets or abandoned sites or just project folders. All of these things our organizations end up keeping because we don't know if we can delete them. What we generally see is that this is upward of 40% of our content. Call it a virtual junk drawer. And before AI, that junk drawer, it was clutter. It was inefficient, but it was survivable. But now that we have Copilot and we have agentic exercises, that clutter starts to be polluting your retrieval. And users start to see that outdated information in their answers. So what we want to do is prevent them to going back to manual search and the promised time savings that they can otherwise materialize. The second one is inconsistent metadata. I know nobody loves creating their own metadata, but without strong signals such as, I'll say, document type, ownership, or status, again, you have less that Copilot can work with. And it can't necessarily determine what's outdated or what's authoritative now. You may have, say, in HR, for example, so you have an HR space and you have the 2024 policies, you have a 2025, 2026 policies. If you had a measure that would tell you what's active, that shows where taxonomy can help. Overall, Metadata is the structure that's going to help with better ranking, filtering, and your search. When it's missing, you'll definitely feel it. Your outputs will be less trustworthy. Third area, I'll say specifically overexposed sensitive content. Permission drift can happen. You may have had inherited access over time. You may have had permissions that you didn't audit before a migration. You may have legacy permission strategies that you still maintain today that you know you need to clean up, but you haven't necessarily yet. Copilot won't create those exposures, but it will make them visible. And the moment that you have a sensitive content that gets shown to a user that shouldn't, that conversation is less about productivity. Now we're focused on privacy and compliance. And the last theme I'll get to here, and that's overall plateaued adoption. And that's usually where these three will converge. Once users have inconsistent response or questionable content, that's when they go to manual workarounds. And now you have leadership knocking on the door of why isn't value showing up? And again, that's why I'll talk to this as an ROI problem, less of specifically a technical problem. Because for many of us, it's not, was Copilot deployed? It's, was our content foundation strong enough for the deployment that we had for Copilot to deliver? So again, different clients, but overall tend to see the same conditions.
And it depends on like when it comes into play. It's been interesting in doing enablement of deciding when should this happen and how to not slow down Copilot while also not slowing down Copilot or other solutions because when I like think about this and I talk to customers about this and clients, that this is a lot of stuff, right? And how do you not eat the elephant? How do you break this apart? And I think it's interesting to think about what those problems are that we're seeing. I think we want to hear from you all.
Yeah, so let's take a poll. You heard about different impacts here. Of those four, which one would impact your organization most?
This one it's been interesting as I do this one, and I'm curious to see what these polls results are because I've probably done this 50, 100 times, and everyone I talk to is just a little bit different. And depending on, I've seen different industries. I think one area I've seen that has evolved, and it's been hearing you talk, Tyler, about the 40% of stale content is the shift in regulatory expectations that organizations have, and the statement that they don't know what they should keep or what they need to keep and retain as it relates to records and regulatory documents. So they keep everything to counteract that, which kind of leads to multitudes of these together. So it's interesting to think about the cause and effect of these. So these are the causes that are more technical, but there can also be a reasoning into why these exist in this way within an organization.
Yeah, 100% makes perfect sense. And looks like our excuse me, our polls are in. We actually have a tie for what's the biggest concern. We have stale or rot content and also sensitive data in your org. Just digesting these results, Drew, when you're working with organizations, do they often know how much content they really have?
No, so no one knows. Like kind of one of the reasons I started with what's your content estate look like is most people don't know where it ends. Like I've started an organization, they're like, I got like a couple hundred SharePoint sites and like 2 file shares. And then, I mean, this has just happened recently. We had talked with them and then we ended up, like, I think we had like 10 terabytes of file share data. By the time we were done, they had 25 terabytes of file share data and thousands of SharePoint sites that they didn't know they were using in different ways. And they found they had some shadow IT on the some box side that they wanted to use. So I would say the majority don't have a great handle on the non-connected information and have used M365 as primarily a file share, either from a file share migration or from just expecting to use it as a file share. I think when I look at the results and see, I think stale is probably the most ROI impacted. When I think of kind of the result, the ROI part of this is that rot data to me will give you worse results from a user perspective. So if I'm trying to build content or work on something and I'm getting content that is non-relevant to me, that's going to decrease my trust and I'm not going to like it. It's going to make me think less of it. From a security perspective, right, number 2, we have sensitive data in our content. if that kind of me interacting with it, it's interesting from an ROI perspective because that's like a different lens. It's a security issue, it's a security challenge. But if once I consume that data and I see that data, it might not like detriment my working life, right? Like it might be beneficial to me to see that information. I probably might not supposed to be, but a lot of organizations need to work with sensitive data. So I actually kind of lean into when we look at this content review and that's the concern relates to AI. If I'm talking to the CISO org or a change management org, I'm going to get different expectations. And I think what the message I want to think of is the ROI that you're going against. It's okay to remove certain amounts of sensitive data, but like rot content to me is like you will get weird results and not the results that you want and potentially wrong results because you pulled the wrong file at the wrong point in time versus inappropriate access.
And I will say,
third party,
oh, go ahead.
When you bring in third party information, then it gets a little trickier because you have to deal with the permission methodologies and those. But yeah, sensitive data is like a I think there's a lot of different ways to I'd say there's actually a miss of organizations don't know what sensitive means to them. What define your your industry is going to have different sensitive data, and interacting with Copilot is in that secure boundary. What is your risk? Is it really the sensitive data that I can see regardless of Copilot, or is it the sensitive data that's going into Copilot that I don't want to be surfaced and put into the LLM? And two different ways to think about sensitive data being surfaced.
Absolutely. And before we move on, we did have one person who has a perfect content corpus. Now, I know that's an ideal state we would all love to be, but Drew, have you ever walked into an environment where a customer genuinely believed they had the perfect content corpus? And what'd you find?
It was a brand new company. It was a single person company that just started up their own tenants. It might have been someone else. But no, I mean, in the state we put it in there in justice that no content corpus will be perfect, even if you do a cleanup. As we're going to go through this, when we get into our blueprint, a lot of this is about continuation and operationalization. That even if your content corpus is perfect on one day, on today, let's say on July 15th, by July 16th, it's going to be something different because of the amount of information. I would say one thing that surprised me as in the last year plus has been the rise of the amount of content that's coming up, like just massive amounts of content creation. Tenants, like 3 years ago, tenants were not filling up. I have multiple customers and clients now that their tenants are very full and they're paying a lot of money to keep that going. So you could have been perfect a year ago. Like after the migration, we did a great migration project, cleaned everything up, and then 6 months later, your tenant's full and you haven't been watching it. So I think there's no, but maybe for one day, for an hour, right at the end of an audit, right at the end of a cleanup. Not for long.
It's not even just people creating content anymore. Now you have users and other experiences creating content as well. It's growing. So let's talk about the blueprint towards this solution. Now, the approach that we outlined here today, it's overall simple. We have 3 steps. It's going to be, first, you have to see it. Then we shape and we sustain. Now, in this first step, you have to be able to identify and classify content that you have. We have to be able to find where are our blind spots. We heard earlier, we may have a clear picture on our M365 estate. Let's see what we have in holistically, and then let's establish a clear view of our content quality across our estate. And then we have to shape it. Shaping is more developing an actionable plan to either cleanse, enrich, label our content so it becomes more relevant and trustworthy and overall AI ready. And then lastly, it's about sustaining. You make sure you have the controls, the automation, the governance in place so that you have an operating model that can fit and not just have your one-time cleanup. So this blueprint, it's looking to do 2 things once. First, let's address our content quality issues that we have that may have affected Copilot. And then let's build the foundation needed to protect AI ROI going forward. Now, to drill into step 1, excuse me, before you can improve Copilot outcomes, you have to understand what content exists, what matters, where it lives, who owns it, and then whether that content should even be discoverable in the first place. So we call this first part, see it. And that's about just quite that, having visibility and being able to take action. So what we generally prescribe is start with identifying your high value content. If you have a lot of data, you don't necessarily have to scan it all up front. And not everything specifically in M365 will matter equally for all your Copilot use cases. Some of your content will be authoritative. You know it's departmentally owned data. Some of your data is crown jewel, it's business critical, or it's frequently used. And some of your data will be tied to regulatory requirements. That's usually where you begin, the data that matters most. And then assess the repositories themselves. And that means understanding what you have, where is it, and what's a connected system. And outcomes of that, you'll start to see who owns the content that we have, how active or current is our actual content, and what condition is our data. In many environments, you're able to uncover here your blind spots, unknown content ownership, stale sites, inconsistent content states. Then that leads you to step 2, and that's looking at permissions. And if you define your permissibility rules, that's about looking at a distinction. Not all content that's accessible should necessarily be surfaced in your AI experiences. So when your outcome of looking at permissions is deciding what content can be retrievable or discoverable, what content is too sensitive and shouldn't otherwise be used. Step 3 gets into classification and labeling. Copilot's going to work better, and we'll be able to show this later, when that content carries a signal and it helps distinguish what's sensitive versus what's current and also what's trustworthy. And your consistent sensitivity labels, they're not just supporting compliance, but also your system's ability to work from your content in the right way. So this phase, think of it as creating the visibility, creating the structure that you need for the later governance step to be more effective. I'll pass it over to you, Drew.
And going into this, think about, when you think about high value content, think about what would hurt your results. Okay, so high value content could be, if we're in an insurance area and we have underwriting files, what are the old underwriting files that we're going to use? What would be a challenge? Like, how do we want to make sure what could hurt that? Because high value content isn't always just like, this is our sensitive data in our organization. It's, these are the types of information we work with to execute a business process, right? If I worked with an organization where from an oil and gas perspective, and we're very adamant on operating procedures. Make sure you have the proper operating procedures at the right time for how this is going to be built, how this is going to be drilled, how this is going to happen. We can have now that, for me, is very high value content, but it's not necessarily sensitive content, but it's high value content because it's steps that can't be wrong. You have to have them they have to be recent. The areas where when you look at the assessment for repositories, not every repository needs AI, right? So if there are locations you don't need it, if there are apps you want to get rid of, this is an opportunity you look at to say that box environment I talked about, that's the time. Let's look at if we really need box. And if they want to keep that, okay, what's the scenario? If not, let's talk about consolidation. From a permission perspective, majority of the AI solutions will use the permission of the prompter. So when you're thinking about this, you start to drill into priorities. Like, when I'm looking at my definition permission rules, what's the most important for me to look at for identification? All company access, large security groups, and then focus on that high value content that you've seen. So sites that are heavily accessed, sites that have a large amount of content, that have all company content, that's where we're really starting to define that risk level before we get into step 2, because classification, as Tyler said, is that precursor to labeling. So classification can take, classification for us is the ability to know what's in our content. So we can say, does this have PHI? Does it have HIPAA? Does it have a credential? And how do we align that to our corporate policies? What are we allowed to work with? So this takes us a step into labeling, but this really, as I said, sets the stage for identifying what we have. So I want to start out with some examples of what we can do from a Microsoft perspective. So there is a feature. I'm going to start on the SharePoint side, and what I'm going to start with is data access governance reports. So data access governance reports are held out in our SharePoint Admin Center here. These give us a way to go run permission reports for our organization. And I can run those. Let me just go back a step. I can run these against, I'll go into here. You'll see I can run a site permission report for my organization. This is what's called a snapshot report. This snapshot report will tell us the sites and organization, sites without permissions, but it will focus both on SharePoint and OneDrive. You can see this demo environment. There's not many things, but I've ran this a report like this across in organizations that can take many days to run and hundreds of thousands of sites. And when I go into this report, we can start to, the way this report is built is focused on total permissioned users, okay? So right here, this will say what sites have the total amount of users in this container, in this site. So I have one site, this can be a single file share, it can be a group, that's one of the best parts. If a group is applied to a site, an Enter group, a SharePoint group, it will extrapolate that group and get the total count of access to that location. And then you can kind of, if you think about correlating that, you can see, well, this site has a ton of permissions and only 7 files. So you can start to make some decisions around what sites are a priority for us. And there's another area here you can start to see. I'm going to actually pull this up. One of the main things I'm doing here is you can download it. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to give you the full view of this report. And you can see a few other areas that are important to note. We can see things like external sharing, the privacy of the site. So we know any sites that are public have all company access. You can see I have labeling. So I have some containers that have some labels against it. I have the number of access there. But if I scroll to the right, we start to see some more information like the different link type and file types. So how many of us have AAAU or everyone permissions or people in your org link counts? How much file sharing do we actually have? Any of these can be files or the whole site that has been granted access to the whole company. Right? Anyone, so from a Copilot perspective, if this is something where high value data is, the way to think about this is I look at this report, this has 10 items that have all company access. What site is this on? I can look at what this site is. That's the root site. That's where my intranet lives. So that's probably not, that's an okay site because that's technically marked as one of my global sites. Now, if this would have been a private site like this one, this might be something that I need to go look at about why they have all company access next to it. But in general, this gives us a path to go identify from a SharePoint and OneDrive perspective, what's there. What this doesn't go into yet is around what type of information exists in there, what type of sensitive data exists in there. To do that in Microsoft, we have the way to do that via data security posture management. Inside of that, they have a data risk assessment that we can run. We can run a default assessment or create our own assessments that go actually look at different information out there. So I can look at that same, here's the Team Deadpool site. I can see what labels apply to the site. I can see items. But what this starts to give us, if you look over here, is total sensitive items. So thinking about the way we identify our content, you have a way to classify it. This is your classification of what type of sensitive information we have. And if I start to go into this, you can see the different options you have on this site, or the different, I mean, honestly, you can see the unique sensitive information that exists on this site. So as I go into this, I can see that this site, I can kind of correlate the two and say I have sites that might have all company access. I can come in here and I can look at the sites that have specific sensitive information types and say, is this something, because of this amount of content, that I am concerned about? Are the sensitive data types that we've built within Microsoft, within Purview, relevant to say, is this an area that we need to go perform an action, right? Perform some type of activity to do that, right? So when you think about this for step one, these are two areas within Microsoft platform that allows us to go and identify and classify the content that we have. But what about step two, Tyler? What do we do in step two?
So once we get to step two, we've already seen what matters. We've done our assessment of our repositories. We've seen our permissions. We may have looked at a classification. Next step is to start to shape. And what we mean by that is let's reduce the noise. Let's enrich our content, protect what needs protecting. And then that's going to help us define a more trusted knowledge base. So we call this one Shape It. Once you have visibility, you can start improving your outcomes, and that's for improving your content, and that will help improve your outcomes. So step one is let's cleanse the content. What we mean by that is let's identify, remove what shouldn't be influencing your retrieval. Specifically, as you mentioned earlier, the starting point's generally your rot. You can get rid of your redundant, your trivial content. Look at your stale data, areas where you have duplicative or unnecessary versions or material that shouldn't be in our active spaces at all. And if that noise, if it stays in the retrieval pool, it's going to be surfaced. Rot removal doesn't have to mean permanent deletion. I know not all of our content can be deleted, but if you look at file level archiving solutions, they can help minimize your end user disruption in this area while still taking that out of the reach from tools like Copilot. Next, let's look at metadata enrichment. This is what's going to help separate content that is understandable versus content that just exists. I look at things like tagging by document type, tag by your department, look at your overall taxonomy structure that you likely have today, because these are going to help improve your signals that Copilot and other related systems that read will be able to determine what's relevant or authoritative. Then we look to anonymize or redact if and only if necessary. So labeling that something's sensitive is important, but you may have a few cases, especially in regulated environments, where just labeling is not enough. So you may need stronger protection. To you, that might need anonymization, old project or client code files. You might need to specifically redact, or in certain cases, enforce encryption on your content to limit what information is exposed. And then somewhat of an outcome, that's about establishing your certified content corpus. This is one of the most important outcomes of this phase. What we mean by this is it's going to define the subset, and I do mean subset, of your enterprise content that the organization is prepared to stand by. We're going to say, this is our most current HR data, or this is our current X department. We would consider that content governed, it's relevant, it's trustworthy enough to support initiatives like Copilot. So in other words, we're not about making all of our content equally fit for AI use, but we'll make that distinction explicit on this phase.
And when I think of cleansing, it's going to be probably the most important part, as I kind of said before, in my opinion, that too many companies are keeping things forever. There's ways we can remove it, which I'm going to show you to at least cleanse in a lighter way. From a metadata perspective, this is an area I want to make sure you understand. This will keep getting better. If you haven't looked at this recently, like when Copilot was first introduced, it did not use Copilot effectively, or did not use metadata effectively sitting inside of SharePoint. So SharePoint metadata doesn't matter, and you can automatically apply metadata now with for Copilot and SharePoint. So there are skills and autofill functionality you can use to automatically create, generate, populate your metadata you have in your tenant. When you're doing labeling, make sure you're doing your labeling as part of your classification policy. So, and if you go down the encryption route, the catch I've seen here is make sure you understand what external access does with data that's encrypted. So if you're thinking, I want to encrypt my data so I protect it going from Copilot into Claude, well, then also is that sensitive data that would be emailed to a lawyer, to a party, a bank that needs that information. So we want to release this solution slowly so you don't disrupt that information. I've been in a scenario where I've deployed some encryption and we missed something, and some files were not able to be received, and we had to retract encryption. It's a large step to take on. So be aware of that, because as you establish your content corpus and you're thinking of what's certified here, it's like, what are the rules that make it certified, right? Have I done a cleanup? Have we done is there permission review? Have we done a route removal? And how are we going to maintain that? As you get to that certified state, and we'll talk in the next step of how do you go maintain that. So what I want to show you here is the impacts of this as it sits in Microsoft again. And I want to start with, I'm going to pull up kind of two files here to show you what the experience is. So I have a file that's called The Best Chicago Pizza. You'll see in here, I have some labels up here. I have a general label in this one. And I have another file over here with a bunch of dynamic watermark called Drew's Super Secret Pizza Sauce. And you'll see up here, I have a classification against that, a label that says it's highly confidential. Now, to understand the impact of that, let's say I look at here, actually, let's say I run a prompt here to say, what are the standout Chicago pizzerias? And you're gonna see it's gonna pull my information. It's gonna pull that file, and you're gonna see that that's a general label next to it. It's an important fact to that. And I look up in the corner though, what's really nice to see is that this chat, it's green, right? Now, if I go do this file over here and I go look at Drew's Secret Pizza Sauce, that was labeled as highly confidential. You're going to actually see that this one says, I can't access the information. I have a rule in place. I was trying to write a blog about my secret pizza sauce, and it says it can't do that. What you're going to see, though, the most important thing up there is I've also had a classification for the prompt and response itself. The response itself, this chat, this conversation, is also part of information that you need to track, right? This is an asset. This is a material asset for discovery. So by enriching the data through labeling, it's actually enriching the prompt and chat experience through standard user documentation, standard user labeling, and it goes into the prompt data here. Now, that's the one way to secure it at the file level. At the higher level, at the site level, let's say I look at that Team Deadpool site. I go back to the site. Okay, this Team Deadpool site, I saw sensitive data. I was scared. I want to cleanse my information. Maybe I can't do labeling. I want to cleanse it. One of the fastest routes to cleanse your information, to remove things from Copilot, is around restricted content discovery. Okay, this is an underutilized solution, which if I look at this, what this will do is this will actually remove content from Copilot. So remove from appearing in Copilot, and it will only be discoverable at the site level. So I can come in, I can say, I don't know what's on this Team Deadpool site. I need to come back and work with it. I can set that RCD back on this site to on, and Copilot will surface that. So the scenario, let's say that sensitive data would no longer be retrieved in Copilot responses, only at the site level. And then we can even delegate that back out to users. So I can be in here on my site. I can look at my Magneto site, and I can even go into my options over here, and I can restrict my content by myself. So I can even delegate that access to site owners, and we can educate people, say, you see bad stuff, you don't see things you like, you've got old stuff, go in here and tell them to restrict that from Copilot, so we can self-cleanse and cleanse from the administrative perspective. All right, step 3, Tyler, what do we got?
The last step is to sustain. And this is where we make sure that all the gains from those first 2 phases, that they're going to last. Because of course, without governance, your content debt's going to return. Environment, it's going to drift again, and your Copilot outcomes will start to degrade. And the reality is most organizations aren't struggling because they didn't do a content cleanup. They may have in the past. They struggle because content keeps accumulating. Permissions may drift, and quality can degrade over time. So the goal of step 3 is to build that operating model that will keep your environment healthy after you do this initial remediation. So first, we say automate lifecycle management. This means continuously identify. Don't just identify once. You have to continuously identify what's stale and redundant and your unmanaged content that needs retention. Handle archival or otherwise disposition rules. Keeping a automated lifecycle management, that's what will prevent your content debt from re-entering after that one-time exercise. So second part is extending your governance controls. As your volume grows, governance can't just rely on manual review. We can't have humans or otherwise users review too much of our content. And that's where capabilities like purview, classification policies, built-in AI controls can help you apply protection and policy enforcement. And then the third is to accelerate adoption the right way. This means don't just enable users to use Copilot, but help them use it with a governed environment. Have consistent policies across your ecosystem, have trusted knowledge sources, and good training. And experiences in SharePoint will reinforce what good looks like here. So the final phase, to summarize, it's more about making your content governance sustainable. And the good news is you've got native and you have partner tools that will help with this work.
Because if you don't do anything, your manual governance will decay, right? So my example of is the content corpus perfect? Like it may be in that day, but it's going to keep decaying after that. And I think the thing to be aware of is monitoring new content creation, new content containers that get created. And we need policies that follow along with that, right? So how do we know when someone leaves the organization? How do you handle that leaver scenario? So if I have a team, I'm on a project site and I leave, how do I make sure that who's going to identify and own that content going forward? Because that is going to be part of your Copilot adoption. So when I do Copilot readiness, I bring in these scenarios, these steps into organizations for governance level changes and under the adoption track. It's not just purely tech enablement. How do I bring that into adoption? So what can that look like from a Microsoft perspective? So what Microsoft has to start is going to be something focused around site lifecycle management. This again is focused on the SharePoint site. This will affect our teams. It affects our SharePoint sites. What we can do here is we can start with a site ownership policy where we can go in and we can make sure that our sites that we have, our containers, have owners. So we need the owners to make those decisions. That's the best route for us. This can even automatically assign owners based on activity of that container. Once we've done that, we're going to run automated inactive site policies. From here, we can run policies that go in and look for sites that have an activity. We can even, when we run this, we can go recertify them. But the thing we can do is we can set them to read only, or we can archive them, right? So we don't always end from a delete stage, but we can find inactive sites, use this tool to help us clean that content corpus before it gets too busy. And this is how we go into a maintenance mode. These can run every 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. How often do we want to run those? right? That's kind of where we need to move into that process. So because what we do with this is, what I showed you there are still going to be challenges with that, right? So come back to what I said at the beginning. I just gave you some ideas around this blueprint for how we can deal with that in M365. And there are some native tooling that doesn't cover, let's say, specific archiving options or policies yet at certain areas. Or how do we find what really crown jewel data means if we're going cross location? And it's interesting as we work in these different content corpuses, content locations, that there's different permissions in different areas too. The way ServiceNow does permissions is different than the way SharePoint does permissions. It's different than the way Google does permissions. And that's all been kind of brought, it all needs to be brought together when we're thinking about our the blueprint that we're working with. As you do that, understand that org change is hard. Like if I'm deploying Copilot and I'm telling people to go archive their stuff, they're going to be like, why? Like, what's the point? I want to keep my stuff. So you need to find what works best in your organization, say based on this content location, based on the type of information that they're working with, what's our strategy to cleanse it, label it, and maintain it? What do you think about these challenges, Tyler?
One of the best questions I would generally get asked is, how do we expand our reach and replicate these policies outside of, say, M365, or have the same consistent policy across all of our organizational platforms? Or they might say,
right.
They'll say, I've got a handle on M365, but how can I expand my reach? And I'd say there are definitely continue to use your M365 tooling, but there are partner tools that can expand this reach. And overall, what I like to see is what you want to have is AI ready content, and overall use a certain measure. I like to see how much content do you have, what's our content landscape, or otherwise make sure that you have measures for tracking readiness so that you can ensure you have observability into your data of readiness factors, not just in M365, but across everything. And with that, let's go ahead and head into a demo.
Stop sharing.
All right. Oh, that's good. Give me a second. First of the demo. Let's fix that. Okay, so what I'm showing here is a DriveIQ enterprise map dashboard. What I've done here is I ran a scan using DriveIQ across all of our data sources. So of course, up front and center, we have our M365 SharePoint data. We've got SharePoint Online, we have our regional data. We also have things like OneDrive, we have Google Drive. For many of us, we may have a large volume of file shares. Of course, you'll have your M365 data, but many of us can't get away of certain file shares. What I like to do first is let's go to step one of the blueprint. Let's see it. Let's see what we have, where's it at, what's impactful, and where's our route. So you can use this type of view to see what type of data that I have that's been rationalized and what % of it is rot. It's all about seeing what you have and where it is. And then you can start to drill into, let's see, if I want to see my SharePoint data, I can see, well, how much SharePoint data do they have in general? Or what if I want to see how much EMEA data do I have? What's my regional dispersion of my data? I can start to understand what I have. And you'll of course see certain boulders. You'll see, if I want to see, well, of my data that I have, is it an active space, like a SharePoint site that has a significant portion of what you configure as rot? This to me looks like an indicator here. If you have 84% rot on your SharePoint sites, that tells us we may have inactive data that's not suitable for SharePoint. Now, step two heads into watching the share here. If that worked with the share, give me a second to fix this. That should be better. Okay. Step two, then I start to look at how my storage is aligned. So if you have visibility into what you have, then set up automated rules to be able to handle all of our sources. So if I were to take you somewhere in here, I'd see how much content do we have? What's our trajectory over time? How's our content age changed over time? And then you can see, do I have a rationalized plan for all of my sources? So if I take you down here in M365, we have an active repository. Are we scanning? Do we have an archival plan if we're needed? But then you're also going to see the breakdown between what do I have that's active versus inactive. And then you can start to see your rot breakdown. Where are my problem children with rot that I should focus my attention to? Once you've used step 2, which is more so focus on, let's look at our rot removal, let's make sure we archive the right content that should exist, and we're able to rationalize our content. Then it brings us into step 3. And step 3 is to use our measures for what is our content corpus ready for AI. I can say, look at holistically here and say, here's against all my connected spaces, what's my readiness score? These are all weighted. There are various indicators that help us determine how ready our data is, or let's say how healthy our content is. I'll drill down here, for example, say I'm looking at the operations department. I want to use an agent for my ops team, and I want to scope to my metrics only to operations. We can see what's our impact score, meaning is our content recent? Is it in the right structure? Do we have the right context? Have we taken the steps from the blueprint? And then I can also have data pulled in from M365 to see your overall trending adoption rate. Since that's a primary indicator you have available to you is, well, are users using Copilot? And where are they using Copilot? I can see how I'm trending over time. And lastly, areas to help me measure how are we trending over time is in my ops team example here, what's my overall classification coverage? Am I applying the right metadata? Do I have enrichment where I should? And I can also see, well, you may have link-based exposure here. Your data is good, but we can improve on this because we have sensitive information that happens to be shared beyond a link. This same pattern is available to us in our M365 sources. We can use this also against our other connected systems. I'll give you an example with Box and sales. We have a sales department for Box, and it's not exactly Copilot ready. So key theme here is having observability into your data, being able to take action on your data from a metadata perspective, get rid of your rot, and then being able to have a dashboard where you can see and track your metrics over time.
And what that means is going to be the main thing to think about is that our adoption is plateauing, right? So we look at Copilot, you might have had it deployed for a year and we're seeing inconsistent content, and why is it plateauing? The goal after an assessment or an audit like this is to look towards ROI, right? Don't just look for it for content cleanup because we think it's the right thing to do because we migrated from an old piece of information. Think of this as truly ways to move to better adoption.
Absolutely. That's the key point here is making sure that the value of Copilot doesn't just improve because it was deployed, but that content beneath it has improved. So that leads us to poll 3. Question for everyone here.
Are you planning to do a content now? So you heard us talk for a while. You heard me and Tyler share some things. I think it's interesting to see, Tyler, every time I see different metrics and data you have and compared to the data I'm looking within Microsoft, I think it's hopefully this kind of showed some ideas for where you can find more value, where you can try to uncover some of this information for this blueprint. And I think hopefully every time I do this, I try to get more yeses to say like, this is a benefit to you. And I think the main thing for the content analysis, even if you've done one, is going to be something. How are you going to maintain those going forward? How have you thought in your organization? What tool are you going to use? Are you going to use SAM? Are you going to use StrategyKey? How are you going to maintain these things going forward?
Excellent. Based on the results that I'm seeing, it looks like we may have inspired a few. We have at least 5 that are looking to do a content analysis.
More than 0. That's good. So I'm going to kind of top of the hour. I think I want to make sure we talk about next steps here. So thank you for or thinking about what this actions here. So thank you for joining. I think what you want to end with is the people who said no. Like I saw someone that said no. Like hopefully you already have some visibility into that. So you know what your inventory is and where Copilot is going to pull that information from. From a very specific scenario, we would say tighten those permissions. So how are you doing access reviews? I think you can do a content review today, but how do you make sure that you have ongoing permission management? And that's through delegating access, delegating permission management, and not sitting on your laurels of what existed today. Labels help. Labels are part of the equation, but labels will not necessarily be as impactful to Copilot if you don't have your classification set first, like what really matters to you. And when you're ending with this, it's going to be what location is most important to us. What locations are going to be where Copilot comes into play, and which ones do we feel comfortable in bringing into M365, bringing them into the graph to bring them into a state for ROI, bring them to a better state for ROI.
Excellent. Well, to close this out, thank you everyone for joining today. We'll reach out. You'll have a recording after this is complete. If you'd like to reach out with any questions, feel free to reach out to Drew and myself. Our contact information is here. Many of your questions are nuanced. You may have industry-specific questions. We're here for your questions. But otherwise, thank you everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.